Okay, good afternoon. I'm Jessica Lescs, attorney at law at the Paris Bar Association, specialized in asylum and international criminal law. We are here today because the European Center for Constitutional Rights, the International Federation for Human Rights, and Lawyers for Justice in Libya are hosting this side event in the margin of the 20th session of the Assembly of State Parties to the ICC. The organizations are grateful to the Kingdom of the Netherlands for co-sponsoring the side event. And I'm very glad to introduce you today to the members of this panel. Katherine Iliopoulos, who is a legal advisor to the Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Libya. Dorine Llanta, who holds a PhD on the protection of individuals against sexual violence and who is currently program officer at the International Federation for Human Rights, permanent representation to the ICC. Marwa Mohammed, who is the head of advocacy and outreach of Lawyers for Justice in Libya, a Libyan and international independent NGO that works on and in Libya, and Chantal Meloni, who is professor at the University of Milan in international criminal law and who is the senior legal advisor at the European Center for Constitutional Rights. On the 22nd of June 2020, the United Nations Human Rights Council established an independent fact-finding mission for a period of 1 year to investigate violations and abuses of human rights throughout Libya, with a view to preventing further deterioration of the human rights situation and to ensuring accountability. The fact-finding mission issued a writing report in October that Katherine Iliopoulos will present. That documents the facts and circumstances of human rights situation throughout Libya. This report finds out that there are reasonable grounds to believe that acts of murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, persecution, and other inhuman acts committed against migrants form a part of a systematic and widespread attack directed at this population in furtherance for a state policy, and thus amount to crimes against humanity. Parallelly, on November 19th, this year also, ECCHR, FIDH, and Law for Justice in Libya filed a communication to the prosecutor of the ICC under Article 15 of the statutes. This communication provides also detailed information and legal analysis on the commission of grave crime against migrants and refugees in Libya since 2011. And these crimes include also murder, enslavement, torture, persecution, sexual and gender-based violence. It underscores that such grave crimes amount to a crime against humanity as they are not isolated and they are committed during widespread and systematic attacks. This communication aims to offer a detailed account and sound analysis of the control and operation system of detention centers in Libya, and it targets Libyan state and non-state actors as alleged perpetrators. It does also point out the impact of the European policies on the pertaining of the situation of migrants and refugees in Libya. So I will let now Katherine Iliopoulos presenting their findings. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank the organizers of ECCHR, Lawyers for Justice Libya, and FIDH for this invitation to join the panel. As has already been mentioned, my name is Katherine Iliopoulos. I'm a legal advisor to the independent fact-finding mission on Libya, and it's an honor to present the findings of our first report. I would just quickly introduce the mandate. It's already been mentioned, but we were established in June 2020. There were some delays to the commencement of our work. Broad mandate by the Human Rights Council to establish the facts and circumstances of the human rights situation throughout Libya, to document alleged violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by all parties in Libya since the beginning of 2016. We were also vested with a mandate to preserve evidence with a view to ensuring that perpetrators of violations and abuses are held accountable. In October, we received a 9-month extension to our mandate. So that takes us up to June 2022, when the members will present the final report of the FFM at the 50th session of the Human Rights Council. Because we were vested with such a broad and general mandate, we were compelled to limit the scope of our investigations for this initial period, at least, to the areas that entail the most serious violations and abuses, and those against migrants definitely are one of those categories. So the resolution that established the FFM, Resolution 4339, made no mention explicitly of crimes under international criminal law. However, as we know, crimes against humanity, for example, are a normative expression of gross and systemic violations of international human rights law, which normatively underpins international criminal law. Further, because ICC investigations regarding Libya extend to events falling within our subject matter mandate and our temporal mandate, and accountability forms part of our mandate too. So therefore, the FFM considered that it was essential, it was crucial actually, in order to fulfill our mandate, that we should also investigate conduct that may amount to international crimes. Unlike the ICC, however, the FFM benefits from a lower standard of proof, making it easier for us to make findings and to give effect to this expression, normative expression. So our report includes findings when we found reasonable grounds to believe that a particular violation was committed. The crimes against humanity qualification was applied not only to the situation of migrants, but also to the situation in the prison system across Libya. I'll now turn to a summary of our findings regarding migrants. We acknowledged in our report the context in which these violations have been occurring. They're obviously ongoing, not just historical. We acknowledge that both state and non-state actors from within Libya and from without Libya, from abroad, foreign actors as well, have taken advantage of the breakdown of the rule of law, the proliferation of weapons and militias that we've witnessed in the post-Gaddafi era, and they've taken advantage of this to perpetrate human rights violations against some of the most vulnerable people in Libya, including migrants. We documented specifically the pattern of interception by the Libyan Coast Guard to ensure that disembarkation would take place back in Libya, and the associated pattern, the linked pattern of detaining migrants in detention centres run by the Department for Combating Illegal Migration, or DCIM. Once in detention, we documented the fact that conditions are so intolerable for migrants that they become targets for extortion by a multitude of players, militias, criminal gangs, traffickers, smugglers. They all have in many instances, links to the state, and they profit from the vulnerability of these migrants and their absence of legal status in Libya. The FFM conducted around 50 interviews with migrants. Some of these interviewees told the FFM that they had endured the same cycle of violence, sometimes up to 10 times. This cycle involves paying guards to secure their release so that they can escape the intolerable conditions of detention, attempting a sea crossing, being intercepted, and subsequently being unlawfully imprisoned again in detention centres where crimes such as murder, rape, torture, persecution, and enslavement all take place with absolute impunity and as part of a systematic and widespread attack on migrants. As such, we found that these acts may amount to crimes against humanity. We also found that Libyan authorities have, for a very, very long time, since the beginning of the interceptions at sea, they have been on notice regarding the widespread and systematic nature of the abuses within the detention centres, and in other cases as well. Rather than investigating and taking appropriate measures, the Libyan authorities have continued to condone a policy of interception and detention. We found that the lack of accountability for abuses suggests the state policy encouraging the deterrence of sea crossings, extortion of migrants in detention, and the systemic abuse. In this report, the FFM did not make findings in relation to the responsibility of third states. And we didn't delineate exactly the responsibility of various actors in Libya and their interlinkages and their relationships with each other. We would need to conduct further investigations to determine the role of all those involved, directly or indirectly, in these crimes. So thank you very much, and over to you again, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Marwa, Mohammed, could you describe maybe the situation of migrants and refugees since 2011 in the context of the conflict and the instability in Libya?
Great, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Katherine. And to kind of give more context on what Katherine had explained in terms of their finding, I think going back to the situation in Libya for migrants and refugees since 2011, and it's important to start with, historically, Libya has been a migrant and refugee receiving country. It was historically, during the Gaddafi era, a destination country for many. Libya relied heavily on foreign labor, and with the presence of refugees of certain nationalities. With the conflict, there was, it's not to say that there was, that during the Gaddafi era, there were not networks of smuggling networks that already existed. However, it was controlled and used as leverage points by the Gaddafi regime at the time. That all shifted drastically with the uprising in 2011, which ousted the Gaddafi regime. What happened following that is a breakdown in the rule of law, the lack of central state security control over most of the regions across the country. As a result of that, with the collapse of institutions, including the security, as well as the economic institutions, the proliferation of weapons, and the proliferation of pockets of conflict throughout the country, what we saw was a large shift in terms of what could be, what is noticed as the conflict economy. And smuggling and trafficking became largely part of that conflict economy. And so the movement of refugees and migrants became part of a larger network that smuggled refugees and migrants into the country. And Libya, formerly a destination country, then quickly transformed into a transit country as more and more people made their way through the southern regions of Libya to the northern coast. And there was a buildup of this movement and these networks that then became a multi-million-dollar industry in Libya, reaching a 3.2% of Libya's GDP in 2016. So it became a large segment of Libya's, of the conflict economy. And this, again, is largely due to the breakdown in the security sector and the economy in and within itself. So it became very lucrative, a very lucrative business to smuggle in refugees and migrants. What is important also, which we highlight in our report and obviously in the ICC submission, is that this movement transfers or shifts between smuggling to then trafficking, while individuals are brought into the country and then find themselves held in places of captivity in unknown locations, and then eventually released after paying a ransom, and then continuing their journey to only find themselves again in a situation of trafficking where they are held in again unknown locations by armed groups, militias, then where they are tortured and raped and all the atrocities that are that will be explained further in terms of the violations that they face and during that time they are forced to pay a ransom. They are as their only way out of their detention. Eventually, as they make their way up north, we see that they may, for those that can make their way by sea, are then intercepted, as was explained by Katherine. There's an interception by the Libyan Coast Guard, who are trained and brought back to Libya. What was established in 2012 was the Department for Combating Illegal Migration in Libya as a result of the large influx of movement in the country. The Department of Combating Illegal Migration is where most of the detentions happen at the northern coast of Libya following interceptions. It's also important to note within this context is that this detention remains outside of a context or framework of law. So it is arbitrary and it is indefinite. The Department of Combating Illegal Migration operates under the Ministry of Interior. However, this detention remains outside of the context. So what that means is that those who are intercepted at sea and brought back to Libya are then placed in these detentions where they can remain indefinitely. There's no way to legally challenge their detention. The only way out is to pay a ransom to get out, is if they're sold into what is then bonded labor. So then they are sold and they have to work for their freedom, or in very, very, very rare cases, they miraculously manage to escape. The Department of Combating Illegal Migration was established within the context to address the movement of migrants, but I think it's also very important to note that these detention centers that are concentrated mostly in western parts of Libya are nominally under the control of the central headquarters in Tripoli. And in fact, these centers are actually run by armed groups or militias that control the territory in which these centers operate. And so while they may, again, fall under the DCIM, they are nominally under that control and so do not necessarily adhere to a certain chain of command and operate on their own. Most of these centers are centers that they're not structured or built as detention centers, but in fact are makeshift centers, often abandoned warehouses, abandoned factories, hangars, and so are not structured or equipped or to inhabit it for human detention, holding. And so you find that they are, the conditions inside these detention centers are abhorrent in terms of the numbers. They're not meant to hold the numbers. They're not equipped. And I think that so it's not only the arbitrary and prolonged detention that the migrants and refugees face inside of these centers, but the conditions inside as well. It is linking this to the conflict and to the weakened state, that these centers that are meant to be under the control of a central authority, again, due to the weakened state, they operate pretty much in kind of their own silos and without that control. So going back to how the lack of action, there have been promises over the years that these centers would be shut down. They remain largely in operation. And Jessica, I see that you want to stop me, but just to kind of zoom in for a moment on how these centers operate is that most of the time these centers do operate in local areas run by local militias who are also not just running a DCIM center, but may also be actively involved in a local conflict. Most of these centers will then be adjacent to weapons depots, to the headquarters of the armed group and militias. So they are intertwined and interlinked, and then we've seen throughout the past 10 years how this has placed many of the migrants who are held in these centers in danger, obviously noting the 2009 bombing of the TeJura detention center as one example of how that plays out. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mohammed. Considering all the description you made regarding the situation of migrants and refugees since 2011, Mrs. Llanta, what are, in your communication, the legal findings on the situation that you made, and which crimes against humanity did you include in your communication?
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you, Marwa, Katherine, and all the others for the event today. I'll start, if you allow me, with a little bit of methodology as how we conducted how we reached the findings. So it is based, the communication and the public report is based on research that we carried out over the course of several years, the three organizations, so ECCHR, FIDH, and Lawyers for Justice in Libya. It is based on the research we made on published report by various institutions, including various institutions, missions, such as the FFM, other NGOs, such as Amnesty, who also had a recent report on this situation, as well as on a joint analysis that we conducted, our organization, over the past 2 years. We conducted, aside from this research, extensive interviews with survivors, both remote and in person, unfortunately, due to the COVID restrictions over the past 2 years now. We did manage to discuss with several survivors, 14, over the course of several days, several hours, to reach our findings. We made sure to respect the do not harm principle, of course, that the survivors were safe in a safe country, and they had access to support system, which was really the base of our interviews, very important for the three organizations. Just to highlight as well, for transparency, that we used interpreters only when necessary, and we really ensured that the best conditions given the situation were put in place. To reflect a little bit on the findings from the FFM, just to say that we also looked at the crimes, but through all the journeys, so before and after interception at sea. We had similar findings. The several crimes that we included in our report and communication are imprisonment and deprivation of liberty, enslavement, murder, persecution, torture, other inhuman acts, and various sexual crimes. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But, and also at the hand of several different actors, smugglers, traffickers, armed groups, militias, DCIM and other guards, official, etc. So state and non-state actors alike. We have decided to focus on crimes against humanity because, just like Katherine mentioned, we found that there is widespread and systematic attack against migrants and refugees as a primary target of the attack. We do acknowledge, though, that war crimes have also been committed and are also being committed. We decided not necessarily to go into detail for several reasons, included that we thought there was a gap with regard to crimes against humanity that was not necessarily as present for war crimes. So decided to focus on those, and just also a warning to say that beyond these crimes that I just mentioned, we acknowledge that there are other crimes. We don't suppose that this is an exhaustive list. It is just based on the interviews we conducted and the extensive research as well. So again, not meant to be exhaustive. Many other crimes have been and are being committed, but this is just a base, founded on our interviews. So maybe just a few words on certain of the crimes. I'm not going to go into detail into all of them because it would take a lot of time. But I will mention some of them, and please, Jessica, make sign if I'm too long. I'll start maybe with enslavement. And again, I'm not going to go into the analysis and the legal analysis because it would take as long as our communication is. But we found that enslavement have taken place in Libya, either in transit, at detention facilities, and at other places of captivity. And these findings include the selling of migrants and refugees while transiting and at market auctions. It includes as well forced labor, with migrants and refugees being forced to work in farming, domestic work, construction work, and others such as rubbish collection, etc. With working conditions that are often unbearable and with little food and water under very harsh condition. We also found a sexual slavery within enslavement, but that we decided to include as a separate and independent crime under the Article 7.1g of the Rome Statute. Few words as well on the torture, which has been put forward in many reports, and again conducted by armed group, militias, police officers, guards, smugglers, traffickers, criminal gangs, a myriad of different actors and different manners under which the pain and suffering included in the definition are inflicted. And this includes repeated beatings with various objects, metal, wooden, plastic sticks, etc., burning with various tools as well, such as cigarettes, hot plastic, heated metals, hanging the individuals from bars and putting them in other very stressful position, kneeling on rocks, electrocutions, including of the genital areas. So many different, I'm not going to go into detail in all of them. And also we thought in our finding, we included conditions in which migrants and refugees are held that were also mentioned by Katherine, either in official DCIM center or other types of facilities. And that includes forcing people to sleep outside, or at the opposite, being confined in containers without access to sunlight, ventilation, or any sort of hygiene, being confined inside a freezer as a punishment, and many other different conditions that could also, that we also included in our findings on other key human acts, together with, for example, family separation, slave trade, inhuman condition at transfer, transport at sea, etc. I would also like to mention persecution. That is very important because it is multi-layered in the situation of Libya. It is perpetrated against migrant and refugees, targeted for the status of migrant and refugees, but also on the ground of race, gender, religion, nationality, political opinion, I mean, and any sort of discrimination ground that are under the statute and the international conventions. And for example, we found that Black individuals have been separated on the basis of their race, subjected to racist slurs, and even called explicitly slaves. And our finding also showed that most of the crimes committed are gendered. And for the enslavement that I already mentioned, for example, female migrants and refugees have been particularly targeted for sexual crimes and a sexual form of enslavement, while men have been systematically chosen for forced labor. Of course, this doesn't mean that the opposite didn't happen, but more that is a pattern that we have seen through our founding. And the last one that I'm going to mention as well, because it goes a little bit beyond the finding from the FFM, is the sexual crimes, because in our finding, we found that there might have been rape, sexual slavery, and forced prostitution, and any other forms of sexual violence of comparable gravity that have been committed in Libya against migrants and refugees. I can't go into detail, and I think my time is almost up, but just to mention that in this last category of other forms of sexual violence, we identified, for example, the creation of a context of constant fear of acts of sexual violence, which is very present in Libya, forced masturbation, molestation, and also one that is very common is forced nudity, particularly during searches for money and phone, and a search that is either internal or external when the migrants and refugees reach new official or unofficial detention sites, or when they are passed by one smuggler or trafficker to the other. And here again, we have a gender aspect, because while all gender are targeted, especially for forced nudity, women are particularly exposed to additional sexual and sexualized violence during and after these events, including the one that we mentioned, forced physical contact, molestation, rape, and others. So I think I will stop here for now, but I'm happy to come back to it after if there is more time.
Thank you very much, Dorine, for this broad picture about your legal findings on the situation and the types of crimes against humanity you did include in your communication. I will give now the stage to Chantal Meloni regarding the establishment of the jurisdiction of the court. In your communication, you urged the prosecutor to become active on this investigation of crimes against humanity. How did you establish the jurisdiction of the court and the link you made between the referral of the United Nations Security Council resolution on Libya situation to the ICC and the crimes against humanity against migrants and refugees?
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for this event. And yeah, indeed, the starting point we need to remember is that the ICC, since 11 years now, has an open investigation into the situation in Libya. The prosecutor at that time was very quick in, after receiving the referral by the UN Security Council, to open this investigation. But what we see with concern is that the situation of the grave crimes committed against migrants and refugees has remained outside of the investigation so far. Although since 2017, the former prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, mentioned the grave crimes committed against migrants in Libya when reporting to the UN Security Council. And it was, I think, the first time in 2017 that she said during this report that Libya became a marketplace for the trafficking and human human smuggling. And the fact is that even if the prosecutor, even very recently on the 24th of November, reported again to the Security Council and again mentioned the gravity of these crimes and the need for accountability, we haven't seen any concrete action by the International Criminal Court. And this is how and why we think the submission that we made was so important, together with other documents, like, of course, the report of the fact-finding mission. And the main concern, of course, could be, legally speaking, that these crimes are not, let's say, integrated or are not linked to the situation as it was referred by the UN Security Council back in 2011. And this is why we, I would say, put quite a lot of effort in establishing, in analyzing why, on the contrary, the court has jurisdiction over these crimes, and why the situation as referred to the court by the Security Council in 2011 is strictly related to the crimes committed against migrants. And this can be done in particular via a direct connection between what is the armed conflict and the following situation of chaos in Libya and the commission of these crimes. So we tried to establish this link through different patterns. I just mentioned some of them. So the first one is the fact that the conflict, the armed conflict in Libya, fostered increased instability and the security crisis in the country that exacerbate discrimination and hostility against migrants and an extreme worsening of their living conditions. So this is a direct nexus, of course, to the conflict. Then we can observe, we documented the fact that migrants are forced to work for armed groups active in the conflict, including, for instance, by transporting weapons and even directly participating in hostilities in some cases. Further, there are clear links and overlaps between what are the main actors involved in the armed conflict in Libya and the perpetrators of the crimes that we are talking about. The same actor who took advantage of the political instability and of the security crisis following the armed conflict, and I'm talking both about state and non-state actors, also engage in the commission of crimes against migrants. Marwa already explained also how profitable these crimes are in terms of profit, money making. And in fact, there is a further link which is to be found at the economic level. So we try to analyze this economic link between the conflict and the systematic exploitation of migrants and refugees, which has become a revenue generating business central to the conflict economy. So our conclusion is that this circle of abuse against the migrants and refugees perpetuates the conflict. And here I stop for now.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for this explanation regarding the jurisdiction of the court. I would like to ask Marwa, Mohammed, on the role of the European Union, you think, beyond, what is the role of the European border externalization policies in the commission of these crimes? Could you maybe explain us or describe what your communication is bringing from conclusion regarding this particular issue?
Thank you, Jessica. I think it's important to note that the communication doesn't necessarily or specifically look at the European role or into the commission of the crimes, but our report, which is a reflection, obviously, of the communication, a more concise version of that. Does take the discussion a little further by looking at EU policy when it comes to the migrant and refugee situation. And I think that against the backdrop of everything that was explained in the first round by my fellow panelists, the situation in Libya for migrants and refugees following the uprising in 2011, as we've seen, has deteriorated to such an extent that it may amount to crimes against humanity. And within that context, what was happening simultaneously while the vulnerability of refugees and migrants is exploited by armed groups and militias and state and non-state actors, the EU was putting policies in place that would eventually close down and externalize these borders and prevent departures out of Libya. And I think what is important to note is that the migratory flow in Libya is always south to north. That's the way the networks work. Many of them are undocumented, although many may have individual asylum claims. However, it is also important to note that Libya is not party to the 51 Convention and does not have an asylum framework. And while it criminalizes the illegal entry, stay, and exit from the country. Within that context, those that are fleeing persecution do not have the right to claim asylum inside of Libya. There's a recognition of certain nationalities by the state that some form of protection, if you will, can be extended to them, mainly that they're not returned home. However, there is no real protection for migrants and refugees inside of the country in the absence of a migration or asylum framework. However, while the flows to Europe peaked in around 2016, policies shifted in Europe that looked at training the Libyan Coast Guard to carry out interceptions and return individuals to what we know is indefinite detention in Libya. So upon disembarkation, every single individual, if they are not transferred to the hands of smugglers, many do disappear upon disembarkation in Libya. They are then transferred to these detention centers where they remain indefinitely. This is a policy that, knowing that there's no legal framework in Libya that may protect refugees and migrants, and knowing that they will fall into the hands of smugglers and traffickers and are then faced with abuse and violations, a policy that continues. In fact, following the training of the Libyan Coast Guard and equipping, so it's not just training, it has been equipping, providing ships, rescue boats, and then training them, providing them with the resources needed to then declare a SAR zone, providing them with resources. There was an MOU that was signed between Libya and Italy to further this collaboration on the returns. And we have seen in turn a massive drop in the numbers of those who are arriving in Italy. It is also, I think, important to note that in the numbers of those that are arriving to Italy, the asylum recognition rates are a lot higher, which is a reflection on Libya's lack of asylum system. So, and this is important to note because the lack of asylum or protection inside of Libya, there's no real way out once you are in. And as I said, the migration flows go from south to north. Once you're in the north, that there's no valve that will allow people to leave this situation inside of the country. And in fact, by training the Libyan Coast Guard, by putting in all these measures, including the Libya's declaration of a SAR zone, search and rescue, including the harassment of the humanitarian NGO ships at sea. These are measures that have all been put in place to stop the onward movement to Europe and effectively then trapping people, refugees and migrants inside of a war-torn country that is not safe for refugees and migrants, as we demonstrate explicitly in our report and communication. And therefore, there is a role to play by the EU and EU member states in the situation of migrants and refugees in the country.
Thank you very much, Marwa, for this explanation about the role played by the European Union and the impact of the European policies on the travel of these migrants. Dorine, I have a question for you regarding the findings that you made. I would be very interested to understand what are the specific difficulties encountered you had to face in documenting sexual and gender-based crimes.
Thank you, Jessica. Maybe just to start to say that in our case, in our mission, of course, one of the difficulties that apply to all the different crimes were the unfortunate restrictions that were around us that made that it was difficult for us to meet with survivors in person. And when it comes to a topic that difficult, that what they suffered in Libya, of course, we had to establish some restrictions ourselves. So just to keep that in mind also in how, despite the findings we managed to get, the difficulties was there for all the crimes. But indeed, for sexual and gender-based crimes, we have an extra layer that is present in every documentation of sexual and gender-based crimes. That was also reflected in the FFM report, being the patriarchy, the social taboo and stigmatization around those crimes, but also fear of reprisals, shame. There are very different reasons for that. Also, the fact that many crimes are committed in situations like this, and some of the sexual crimes might be invisibilized or might feed other crimes, so they might be seen all together. So we might focus a little less on some of these crimes. For example, when it comes to torture with regard to genitals, etc., we would maybe more generally go to torture, to the broader act of torture, etc. So that's just an example, and this is true in general, but this is also of course, true in the Libyan context. In our case as well, to mention, of course, that due to all the restrictions I highlighted, we didn't necessarily have the gender balance that we would have hoped in our interviews. And this affects the finding on sexual and gender-based crimes. Why? Because even though those crimes are committed against all genders, in some situations, such as Libya, women and girls are most victims of such crimes. So of course, by interviewing more male victims, we had mostly indirect testimonies. And that's true, for example, for especially for sexual slavery and enforced prostitution. It is, though within the testimonies that we got, it does appear that it's a widespread, systematic form of violence in almost all the camps and with almost all traffickers. But those are indirect, of course, testimonies, because that is something that you see a lot. But of course, it is more complicated to document the actual crime system, and it involves so many actors, etc., that it's always very complicated to document crimes so complicated, such as sexual slavery and enforced prostitution. Something else that I want to mention that is related, that go a little bit beyond the documentation, is once we are documenting this, the difficulty to secure accountability for these crimes, to really understand and ensure that these crimes are understood in their context, the role they play in breaking the victims, their family, the community in general, be conscious of the consequences. And I think all this goes together, right? You need to understand also that for proper documentation, and it has proven very difficult in the past decades, since forever, to document and secure accountability for sexual and gender-based crimes. And while we've made some progress, I'm thinking at the ACC, for example, on sexual slavery in past decisions, it's still very complicated to really secure convictions, etc., for acts of sexual violence. And I'm thinking about this category that I mentioned, this broad category where we include findings on forced nudity and creating a context of fear of sexual violence, is that the gravity of those, so this is in the definition, right? They need to be of sufficient gravity or equal gravity as the other crimes. And despite their egregious and serious nature, it is often recognized that it's not as grave enough as the others, while of course, in situation it is, and for the victims it is. And I guess that also reflects sometimes in the documentation. And if we don't recognize it ourselves as something that is grave enough to be prosecuted, then also maybe it won't be spoken of, because we're not recognizing as something that is worth mentioning, which is very problematic. And again, particularly this category has never led to any convictions at the court. And at the opposite, we had some findings that might be a little step forward, doing a step forward, backwards, sorry, if you want. I just want to finish by saying a few words to highlight, though, the positive step taken by the OTP lately that might help the documentation and the conviction for sexual and gender-based crimes, building upon Fatou Bensouda's legacy, including the appointment of really extraordinary experts as special advisors to the prosecutor on gender persecution, sexual slavery, and sexual violence in conflict, and also the policy on gender persecution that is ongoing, and that they actually discussed yesterday during also a side event. So I think we're really looking forward to these changes, because it's going to help future documentation and future investigation and prosecution of such crimes.
Thank you very much, Dorine, for this explanation about the difficulties that you had to face in documenting and interviewing victims of sexual and gender-based crimes. Before going back to an issue that I would like to ask to Chantal, Meloni, I just wanted to let the participants know that they can ask some questions at the end. So we will have a few minutes. If you want to prepare your question, you can send them through a message to the panel. Regarding what Dorine just said, Chantal, and considering the specific difficulties to conduct investigation in that type of matters, and regarding the type of crimes we're talking about, why do you think this investigation must be conducted by the International Criminal Court, and why then the states themselves cannot conduct this investigation?
Yes, thank you, Jessica, again. Yeah, indeed, what Dorine just said at the end is one of the reasons that definitely, in our view, waits in for the ICC becoming active and investigating directly these serious crimes we are talking about. When we listened, and we listened very carefully to the prosecutor speaking to the UN Security Council on the 24th of November, which, by the way, was the same day where we published our report, we really appreciated the will and the commitment that he put before the council to reinforce, to strengthen the investigation in Libya. At the same time, as I was telling you, we were concerned by the language used. And the language used again this time, similar to what had been used in the past by the prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, is mirrored by the tools that the ICC used so far, meaning we haven't seen an active investigation. We haven't seen a warrant of arrest issued by the court for one of the well-known perpetrators. Some of the names are very well known. We are talking about people that are under UN sanctions. We are talking about people that are mentioned in the public reports, and of course, a fact-finding mission, and by our communication as well. Now for years. So I think these crimes are very well documented, but what we got for now from the court is at least an impression that the court, the focus is not to become directly involved in the investigation and prosecution of these crimes, but rather to encourage and support state cooperation. And the prosecutor himself, here I would like to quote him, what he said the other week. This situation, he was specifically talking about the crimes against migrants and refugees. This situation, by any benchmark, is of such magnitude and complexity, and it involves multiple states and regions, that it calls out for imaginative and nuanced responses. Now, we totally agree with this. The problem is that the nuance or imaginative response that apparently the court has put in front of the council is, again, this cooperation with state authorities. In particular, there is a joint team, as you will know, between the court, the Netherlands, Italy, the UK, Europol, which for sure is doing important work. And we also commend the efforts done by domestic prosecutors. Very recently in October in the Netherlands, there was a warrant of arrest executed, and someone was charged in the Netherlands for the commission of these crimes. And of course, also the Italian prosecutors have done several cases, and some of them have resulted also in convictions, some of them even life imprisonment. What is the problem here? The problem is what we see is that these domestic prosecutions, however important, cannot encompass the complexity of what is going on in Libya. They can only tackle individual incidents, acts, crimes. Sometimes the perpetrators are very low level. And we believe that it is really only the ICC that is placed, that the ICC is best placed to tackle the complexity of these crimes and is able to fully capture the gravity, something that the national jurisdictions cannot. Also, because there is an issue of immunity. And what the ICC can do because of Article 27 in the Rome Statute, of course, domestic prosecutors cannot. And the political obstacles also that could shield some high-ranking perpetrators from prosecution in front of domestic jurisdictions can be overcome better at the ICC. So I see our time is very short, but I just want to conclude on this by saying that we do really believe that the situation requires imaginative and extraordinary responses, and that it's, of course, something positive, this interaction between state national prosecutors and the International Criminal Court. So this is something that we totally support. We would like, and this is what we urge the prosecutor to do in our communication to the court, we would like to see the ICC become active, issue warrants of arrest, conduct its own investigations, open cases regarding these very grave crimes. And we believe that only an integrated system can tackle the complexity of what is going on in Libya in front of our eyes for so many years now, and that everyone agrees that it absolutely needs to be stopped and accountability needs to be pursued.
Thank you very much, Chantal. Thank you very much to all the panel. I don't see any question for the moment from the participants. So we're going to close the session. Just to tell the participants that Dorine sent the link to the public report that is the public report regarding the communication of the ECCHR, FIDH, and Lawyers for Justice in Libya, so that you can consult. Thank you very much for the organization of this event, where you retrace the complexity of the situation, list an important number of crimes committed against migrants and refugees since 2011 in Libya, and amounting to crimes against humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.